Hello and welcome to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on how to deliver software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
You're listening to Season 3. We're focusing on teams. I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader in all things CI and CD. And today I'm joined by Joe Duffy, co-founder and CEO of Pulumi. Joe, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So this is exciting from a Pulumi perspective because it's a bit of a repeat, but not. In that back in Season 1, we had a chance to speak to a couple folks from the DevRel team there. And so learned a little bit about Pulumi, I knew about Pulumi, but hopefully listeners learned a little bit about Pulumi. And one of the themes that kept coming up in that conversation that was really interesting was, psychological safety, creating space to learn, all these sorts of things. And I think in the discussion of teams, from Project Aristotle from Google and other places, We've learned a lot in our community, in our industry about the value of psychological safety. And so I might be jumping to conclusions, but my guess is as a CEO and co-founder, you're probably an architect of the culture at Pulumi and probably have some thoughts on psychological safety. So I wanted to just get, I'm excited to get your thoughts, your opinions on not just the value of that, but creating an environment in which folks, feel safe, feel like they can learn, feel like they can take risks and really move the needle forward. So to kick things off, why don't you just give us your perspective? What is psychological safety and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, it's a very important topic, not just for Pulumi, but I think as an industry. And it's honestly something that if I look back on my career, I've definitely seen the opposite of that environment quite a bit and sort of learned from that. And I think starting a company is kind of a unique experience. As you say, you basically architect the culture. And if you don't, you end up somewhere accidental. And so we did, it was as much about creating an amazing team and an amazing culture as it was a product or a technology. And ultimately, as you scale an organization, culture is everything. And it's hard to, instill the culture intentionally, but it's even harder to maintain it as you scale if you're not intentional. And I think, one of the key things that I've always believed is, everybody should have a seat at the table, regardless of their background, their level of experience, their specific role. And I think to do that, for that to actually work, you need to have a culture of psychological safety. And what that means to me is no idea is a bad idea. We're all in this together. We're all trying to solve these problems together. We're coming at it from different backgrounds. And we have to be respectful that, hey, some people are going to approach solving a problem different than I might or different than you might. And I think making space for that, honestly, you look at the opposite of that. I've heard, I worked at Microsoft for many years, and I saw, I think, the best and the worst of culture there. And it's not specific to Microsoft. You see this in any large company where, somebody would toss out an idea and you'd hear somebody say, oh, that's stupid, it would never work or what. And when you're in that environment, you actually get kind of worn down. You stop sharing your ideas, you stop contributing, and that's the opposite of psychological safety. The idea is that you're not afraid to participate in team activity, in solving problems for the business, that you're actually encouraged to do that. And the space is made, for those contributions. And I think that's hard to do, but when you have it, it feeds on itself and you build this amazing collaborative culture.
That's awesome. And I there was a little smirk when you named Microsoft as if you were going to tell me they have the worst culture. But I think you're exactly right. As companies get to, you talked about growing and maintaining, you end up with pockets, right? You end up with sort of different cultures across the company. But one thing that's interesting to me is you're focusing in that description on kind of ideation, right? Like the early point of maybe working on something. And a concept that feels related to me is blamelessness. We talk about that a lot in terms of like something didn't work out. Okay, we had some ideas, we picked an idea, we agreed to it, but that was before we did anything. So then we did some stuff and it didn't work out, right? Something went wrong. And being willing to sort of look at that and reflect on it and say, okay, what can we learn? Or was there something we didn't understand? Could we do better next time as a group? And I'm curious how you see the interplay of those concepts and then what I took away from that that you didn't say explicitly is sort of that the early phase, if you don't start from comfort in the ideation, you'll never be at the point where you're comfortable sort of, accepting that things don't always work out and that's okay. And so how do you see the interplay between those two pieces?
Yeah, it's a very good point. It starts from ideation and then building and then execution. And then, there is accountability. It's important for high performance teams to have accountability, but it's not, hey, we did this idea. We all agreed to do the idea, but it was, it came from the seed came from something that you had contributed, and ultimately it didn't work out. Well, that's a team learning opportunity. That's not you did something wrong. And the same is true of blameless postmortems, right? If something, we have a production outage and the service is taken down, and yeah, maybe somebody made a mistake, but honestly, in that case, there should be systems in place that help ensure that people, no one individual can make a mistake that actually takes down production. So it's not when you have those experiences, you don't focus on the individual and what did Joe do wrong here? It was, as an organization, what can we learn from this? And going forward, what should we be improving upon to either learn from that maybe it was a growth experiment that didn't have the intended result. Maybe it was a product feature that ultimately didn't have the product market fit that we thought it would. Maybe it was an outage in production. And all these cases are opportunities for the organization to learn. And the thing that kills me is not only is blaming someone making that individual a scapegoat for something that is inappropriate to treat that way, but it's also a missed opportunity to learn from that experience. And so that it's actually kind of a double positive that you create this culture of psychological safety and learning, but you also can improve and go forward from there.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think that it feels like they're very tightly coupled in the sense of the environment in which people feel very comfortable putting out their ideas and the environment where you're willing to try things, right? I mean, it's trying out just at a super cheap level as a conversation, trying it out at a slightly bigger level. We tried some, you mentioned a growth experiment or something, which I think is a great example or microcosm for how we can think in other places, because I think folks who work on growth tend to think in experiments. And sometimes when we shift into product, this is not a thing that we're just experimenting with. We don't know. Let's be honest, we almost never know. And so building that sort of experimental mindset allows you to move faster and allows you to, try new things and see what works and then adapt more quickly rather than sort of doubling down because, it was your idea and, you're going to get blamed. So you're desperate to find a way to make it work versus just cutting your losses and moving and trying something else. So, we said architect of the culture, whatever. How do you build that environment? I mean, what are for you some of the core pieces when you set out to create the culture and then through the process of trying to maintain the culture as you grow? What are the things that you've focused on?
Yes, it's honestly, I've had two different experiences in my career. One is starting something from scratch where you can really architect the culture intentionally. And the second, which is way harder, to be honest, is when you inherit a team and you have to sort of take the team in maybe a different direction. And so the culture needs to change. I'll say for the first one, it's not easy, but it's much easier. You start by leading by example. You actually demonstrate that value to your team in everything you do. And you have to be super consistent. You can't deviate. If any exception will undo, months or years worth of progress. So you have to be super consistent and intentional. And then you hire to support those. And the people that you bet on, the people you put in leadership positions says a lot to your team about what's important to you and what cultural traits are important. And again, if you're inconsistent, you risk ruining the whole thing. So you have to be very intentional. And in the event you make a mistake, you have to correct it very quickly. And then, being open and transparent about your values. I think, what is, I don't know if it's an actual study, but, people said hey, somebody has to hear something 7 times before they're going to remember it. And you just have to be, repeating it and explicit. And then it starts to reinforce itself at some point. And then you scale the organization around that. And people see the benefits as well. And the interesting thing about this particular one, there are other parts of culture that are important, but the psychological safety, everybody has a seat at the table, and actually leads to people being a lot more committed to preserving the culture as well. If you have a toxic culture, people are more likely to just engage minimally, and maybe it's a 9-to-5 job, and they're going to start clocking out, and they're not as deeply invested, but they feel like, hey, I'm part of this team, I'm part of this culture. Then it does reinforce itself, and people do really double down on their commitment.
Well, that's a really interesting topic. The engagement in the culture, the desire to maintain it, not just the commitment to the organization because this is a place I want to be, like I like this culture, but the desire to keep that culture. So as a leader, one with a scary-ish title, how do you ensure that you get feedback from the broad organization when things are going off track? Like, how do you ensure that you have visibility into that you can correct? I mean, you talked about correcting problems if you put someone in a position that isn't aligned. How do you make sure that you know about that?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of doing things that don't scale until they don't scale. And so the things that work for a team of 10 are different than a team of 100, or different than a team of 1,000 and beyond. But I think, just really staying in tune with how are people feeling, what is actually happening on the ground floor. I think a lot of people, when they get into higher level management positions, they sort of abstract away the inner workings of their organization. And so unless one of their direct reports bubble up an issue to them, they don't see it. I'm always just trying to get a good sense of how are the folks on the team doing, checking in. If there's anybody I'm concerned about personally, I'll make sure, grab a coffee with them, just go, say, hey, how are things going? And you'll be surprised at how many anecdotes or, things you hear, either positive or negative, that otherwise wouldn't have bubbled up to you. But I think, again, just explicitly, we talk about our values a lot. I think one thing that Amazon has done, I think, well, although Amazon's kind of hot or cold, depending on who you talk to in terms of the culture there. But I think the one thing they've done well is they have these values. People will actually talk about the values and say, hey, this isn't customer centric. We're not going to go do this. Or, this isn't value X. And I think, being intentional about those cultural values with your team as well and making it part of the conversation ensures that you don't forget it, that it doesn't fall by the wayside.
Yeah, I think explicitness is extremely valuable, just as you described, to ensure that people are that they have it top of mind. And also, I think, going all the way back to hiring, putting the right people in place, like there isn't one right set of values. There's the values of the company that you're thinking of working at, right? And if those aren't aligned, like let's have that conversation before you come work here. And if it's going to be a struggle to work in this way, go work somewhere else. That's okay, right? And I think we're often so focused on, like, I heard this company is great, I want to go work there because other people have told me it's a great place. I mean, pick Amazon. You just said people are hot and cold on it. For some people, those values are perfect. And for others, they're like, this isn't for me. Awesome. Like, the more we're explicit about that and just say, this is what we expect from people who work here, the better the more likely we are to have people sign up who are say, yeah, I want to uphold those values. I want to live in that way. I'm excited about working there. And then, to your point, be the protectors of that culture and, continue to invest in it because it's what they signed up for. It feels like, just there's a lot more that we could say. I often say this even about just what we're working on. Like, every company has problems. These are our problems. Are you interested in those problems? Come work here. If you're not interested in those problems, probably it's not the right place. That's totally okay. I think being explicit in so many places is super valuable. So is there anything that you've tried along? I mean, you said you're a fan of doing things that are unscalable until they break you. It wasn't exactly how he said it, but then, then you try to find another way. Is there anything you've tried, to use the word experiment that really didn't help or kind of went not the way you planned in terms of, building culture, getting people aligned around how you want it to work?
I don't know if it's a good example, but there's a failure mode that I had many, many times, and I eventually learned my lesson, but it took me a while to learn it, which is, sometimes it's easy to overlook the cultural mismatch. And, sometimes it's better to admit early that, hey, like you say, being explicit, right? Oftentimes there's this implicit set of expectations on folks. And if there is a misalignment, it's easy to turn a blind eye and say, oh, well, it's okay. So I had this one example, hyper productive engineer, one of the most productive engineers I've ever worked with, but he was, kind of a jerk and was a threat to the, psychological safety of the team. People are afraid to share ideas with him because he would just shoot them down. He'd say, oh, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. And yet he was so productive. And so, and I turned a blind eye to that. I would convince myself, oh, it's okay. The strengths outweigh the weaknesses. And yet that's the number one thing that you can do to really just threaten to unravel the whole culture, because your whole team sees that. They see who do you trust? Who do you reward? And if you're rewarding people that are not kind of sharing the same cultural importances that you have, then people don't believe that you believe in it as a leader, and it can very much unravel quickly. And I've made that mistake many, many times in my career. And now I've kind of learned, okay, as soon as you detect that, you need to take action on it. And, give people the benefit of the doubt, believe in them, but you got to be explicit. To tie it back to your previous thing, like a lot of people just assume people implicitly understand the culture, but you have to just have those conversations, and you can turn it around, but it's not just going to happen by itself.
Yeah. Amazing how often this explicitness comes up. I mean, setting expectations, right? To your point, maybe the expectations weren't clear. Okay, let's have that conversation. Here's what's expected. Here's how we work here, whatever that is. Some people adjust. Some people say, that's not for me. That's fine. We should just have those conversations. I think I don't know what the name of that archetype is, but certainly the hyper-productive engineer who doesn't fit the culture that's not the first time that's come up in conversation, won't be the last. I think it's a great example, right? Of just acknowledging, hey, this isn't working. Cool. So, we started from this foundation of heard from folks at Pulumi in the past. Psychological safety was really big. Lots of insights on that. Is there anything else, like when you just think about the broader spectrum of building effective teams? In fact, I was about to say, is there anything else? But you mentioned accountability earlier, and I wanted to come back to that. So let's actually hit that first, and then you can tell me if there's anything else. Broad spectrum of teams. When you think about psychological safety, blamelessness, and accountability together, I don't think they're counterpoints, which I think is where you're going. But how do you maintain that balance? How do you ensure that folks are accountable for what they've committed to, but it's a safe environment to try things and fail at them?
Yeah, they're definitely all related, and it's sort of almost like a triad of they're self-reinforcing if you do it the right way. I think taking some of the emotion out of accountability, I think, is important. It's not like somebody's going to get punished if something doesn't happen. It's just about being. Man, I think there's a theme for this conversation. It's about being explicit about expectations. Like, I'm going to give you a ton of space to innovate and think big and do something great and pursue your thesis of, like, whether it's a growth idea or a product idea. But you just need to tell me as a leader, like, what are my expectations? On what time frame will we know, is this thing working out? And what data are we going to use to determine success? What does success even look like? Let's talk about that before we start, so that I know what to expect, and you can just run and do this thing that you want to do. But we're going to hold you, quote, accountable to, hey, and we can course correct. We're going to learn things as we go, so we can always change the expectations. But let's just have a conversation of, okay, what are we going to expect on what time frame, and how are we all going to learn together whether this is working or not? I think, like, it's easy to assume, empowering others or deferring, letting folks run with their ideas and giving people the psychological safety. It's easy to assume that means no accountability, but there is accountability. But it's not personal. It's not emotional. It's, hey, we talked about this project. We're going to go do it, and then how do we know whether it succeeded or not? And we're going to hold you accountable to that part, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It absolutely does. And what I take away from that a little bit is you talked about it as the emotional element. I'm thinking, I'm struggling a little bit to phrase it. I don't know if I'm going to be helpful, but what I'm committing to and holding myself accountable to and would expect to be held accountable to is that I'm going to go try, and that we agree that this is a thing worth trying, but we're not 100% certain that we're going to hit the outcome. right? We know what the outcome is we're striving for. Like you talk about growth experiments a bit. We know that we're trying to increase return rates or like total lifetime value of a user, whatever that might be, right? And change the shape of our funnel. And we have some ideas, and we're committed to trying those ideas and being really open about whether it's working or not. It's not that, that if it doesn't work, then we have to have it's a big blow up. It's that if I didn't actually try, if I said, I'm going to go do this thing and then I just didn't do it, like that feels like there should be some, that feels like a broken accountability model. But if I did the thing and we did the thing we discussed and it just didn't happen to work and we're going to go try something else, that's like we want that space. Because if we're not willing to experiment, we feel like we have to be 100% right before we even try something. We're never going to try anything.
Yeah, and it's hard sometimes, like, a failure mode here that I've seen, especially this is at a big company, this can happen a lot, which is, hey, you get resources to pursue a new project, and maybe you can build a team of 30 people or something, and then you get executive sponsorship, and then you're off to the races. But a lot of times, the original thesis of the project, you kind of lose sight of that, and especially in a big company, you can go for years on this project that never actually succeeded, and somebody let you run with it, and where's the accountability there? Because it wasn't clear, how are we going to measure success from the outset? And then, especially as a CEO running a large team, the inefficiency of that just adds up very quickly. And so I think it's pretty important to just be honest and intellectually honest with ourselves about what's working, what isn't working. And it's okay if something doesn't work out, right? We're going to learn from that. And I'd rather try something and experiment than get stuck in analysis paralysis, forever, because that's inefficient as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to your point, or rather than doing the analysis, just deciding you're going to do the thing, and even when it's not working, continue on that path because you were committed to it. I mean, that's just burning time and energy. All right. Well, I want to go back to the broader topic of teams, but this actually feels like a great opportunity to get into the team spotlight. So as a way of expressing what you think about teams, maybe can you tell us, or well, us, I guess us is me and the listeners. I don't know why I feel like it's us today. About the best team that you've ever worked on, and maybe a specific point at which you thought or realized, oh yeah, this is what a great team feels like.
Yeah, I've had the fortune to work on many great teams. I think Pulumi is an amazing culture, amazing team. But in terms of other teams, there is one that was sort of a turning point in how I thought about team building. It was a team at Microsoft. We were building an operating system. It was a very ambitious project, but it was a very unique project as well from a culture standpoint. This was where, the architect of that culture had some certain things that were very important, and everybody having a seat at the table was one of them. No matter what your background is, you can contribute. And it was just an incredible collaboration where you'd see people working on the programming language, actually collaborating with people building the operating system kernel to make sure the programming language was, ideally designed for the use cases. And it was very customer centric and very, collaborative across team boundaries. It was almost like there were no team boundaries, even though the team was quite large and the project was quite ambitious. It was also interesting, there's kind of no ego as well. It was kind of unique because it was many of the most senior engineers I've ever worked with, or probably ever will. You had distinguished engineers and technical fellows, which is the highest title for individual contributors at Microsoft, just writing code. You had ex-CTOs that were actually writing code, like that were building entire file systems from scratch. Legendary engineers that, the guy who built the NTFS file system, for example, was just like an engineer on the team. And it was just this like explosion of just amazing talent. But it distilled things down to the essence of, hey, we're all in this together. We're building this incredible, project together. We're dreaming big, and there's no ego, and we're all in it together. And that actually created this psychological safety as well. Just because it felt like we were just rowing in the same direction downstream.
I feel like I might be projecting, but one thing I took out of that was the clarity of purpose. Like, we're all excited about the outcome we're trying to get to. And so I'm in that environment as someone who's, I'm going to pretend that I'm really accomplished, but like if I project myself into that like very experienced person who has a lot of exciting things on their resume, they care less about that and their position in this environment because they know, one, they're surrounded by other people who have the same sort of accolades, and two, they're so excited about the outcome that how you get there and who contributes what becomes less important. And I think mission, clarity of purpose, however you want to think about it, is a really big factor in building that environment. Does that sound like a reasonable reflection?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. People were willing to make pretty big sacrifices. People that could have been running hundreds of person, engineering teams, or could go off and start a company, but because they were all rallied around that shared sense of purpose, it didn't feel like work. It felt like, hey, we're doing something incredible.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. Since we're expanding our view of teams, is there anyone that you think we should talk to who about building great teams that maybe you've worked with in the past or currently, or that you think has a really good perspective on this?
I look at other high performance cultures that I think have done a good job of creating innovative organizations. And I definitely think of, folks like, Matthew Prince comes to mind for Cloudflare. That's been an amazing business. I think they just hit $1 billion in revenue recently. So I would personally love to hear his opinions on that, but that comes to mind for sure. I think Satya at Microsoft, he, honestly, I was there when Satya kind of took over from Steve Ballmer, and I was personally involved in a lot of the projects that he pursued initially, like open sourcing .NET. And honestly, that was an interesting experience because we went from being a very Windows-centric organization to suddenly going well beyond that, thinking about Azure, thinking about the cloud. I had my team suddenly ditch their Windows laptops and get MacBooks, and the culture transformation is amazing. But, how he did that so quickly was really impressive. But I think, other folks in that same circle, Scott Guthrie over there as well. But if you can get Satya on the show.
Yeah, challenge accepted.
I would listen.
Well, I'll just text him this afternoon and see if I can get him to show up. Sounds good. Some great ideas, though. I agree on Cloudflare as well. Really fascinating business, doing very well. Right on. Well, thank you so much for joining. Thanks everybody for listening. If there's anyone you want us to talk to, find us on Twitter at CircleCI. Tell your friends, subscribe, get them to subscribe on your podcast provider of choice. And look forward to speaking to you all again in the future. Joe, thanks so much again for joining.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone.